Welcome, everybody. My name is Brooke Heffright. I am the director of the CINA Center at George Mason University. I've only been in my position since December, and this is my first opportunity to host our Distinguished Speaker Series. So I'm really excited about this one, excited to see all of the interest from stakeholders, and really excited to hear from our speaker today, Professor Christian Meissner. So first of all, I'd like to welcome you to CINA. CINA stands for Criminal Investigations and Network Analysis. We are a DHS Center of Excellence hosted at George Mason University. And our particular mandate is to advance the DHS and the US government's mission to counter transnational organized crime. So Professor Meissner's talk today will complement CINA's research theme of criminal investigative processes. So I know we have a lot of folks from DHS and from the component on the line. Just to give you some orienting background, DHS Centers of Excellence are managed by a DHS S&T Directorate's Office of University Programs. They are built around a long-term cooperative agreement and led by individual universities to conduct groundbreaking research resulting in rigorous, objective knowledge products and timely solutions for DHS components. So just to underscore, we are your center if you're in DHS or one of its components. In fact, CINA is supported by a DHS board of directors, some of whom I think are on this call today, and their engagement helps us to ensure the relevance of our research and to identify champions of funding for transition. So if you are excited about what you hear today and think that CINA research can help complement your component's mission, please put your email in the chat, respond to our follow-up survey, or just visit our website at cina.gmu, that's for George Mason University, gmu.edu to join our mailing list. Once we hear from you, we are happy to follow up with a bespoke capability brief for DHS or for any other US government stakeholders to help identify champions who want to get involved in research for transition to the mission. So with that, I'm going to turn to today's agenda. I'd like to introduce Professor Christian Meissner, our speaker today. He is going to be speaking on mitigating resistance by developing rapport and trust in investigative interviews. Professor Meissner is currently Director of Graduate Education and Professor in the Department of Psychology at Iowa State University. He received his PhD from Florida State in 2001 in cognitive and behavioral science. His research focuses on empirical studies of psychological processes involved in developing rapport and trust, understanding resistance motivations, facilitating recollection, and assessing credibility in investigative interviews. Dr. Meissner's research has been funded by the National Science Foundation, U.S. Departments of Defense, Justice, and Homeland Security, and by the U.S. intelligence community. His scholarly and practice contributions have been recognized by the American Psychology Law Society, the International Investigative Interviewing Research Group, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He's also an elected fellow of the Association for Psychological Science, the American Psychological Association, and the Psychonomic Society. So with that, I'd like to give a warm welcome to Dr. Meissner. Take it away.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Brooke. Thank you, Carrie and Sarah, for inviting me. I want to start by noting that a lot of the work that I'll talk with you about today has been funded by the FBI and by a particular program called the High Value Detainee Interrogation Group. Much of what I'm going to talk with you about today is a little high-level view of the findings that we've had in this area. And I'm going to talk through the research by showing you some data from individual studies, but also talking through a series of meta-analyses that we were funded to do across a number of different areas, just to give you that kind of broad scope view of the efficacy or effectiveness of these techniques. So a little bit about an agenda for today. I want to start off talking with you about this shift that we're seeing, a move from customary practices that focus on accusatorial or confrontational practices to today science-based approaches to interviewing, identifying what works, what's effective, and implementing those. I'll talk with you about that shift and that surge in the literature. I then want to talk to you about three challenges that we often see in the interview context. One challenge has to do with the investigative mindset that investigators bring into the interrogation room. The second is the challenge of facilitating recollection from individuals who may often say, I don't quite remember that incident or that experience very well. And the third challenge is, of course, understanding resistance. What is resistance? How does it manifest? And what are some ways in which we can mitigate that resistance? And then finally, I want to spend a little bit more time talking about developing rapport and building trust as a way of creating a voluntary cooperative context within which we can mitigate resistance and facilitate information collection. So let me start first with this kind of shift that we're seeing from customary practices to science-based methods. And I think it's always good to start with some case studies here, just to illustrate some of the challenges of these customary practices. This is Bruce Gottschalk. In 1986, two women in the same apartment complex were raped and assaulted. One of the two victims created a composite sketch, and that composite sketch led someone to identify Bruce Gottschalk as the contributor here. The police interrogated Gottschalk and obtained a taped confession that contained information not available to the public. An identification of Gottschalk subsequently by one of the victims, a jailhouse informant who claimed that he'd made inculpatory statements, serology that couldn't exclude him, and his taped confession ultimately led to his conviction of rape and burglary. It sounds like a pretty open and shut case, right? One more for you. George Allen Jr., 1982, Mary Bell was sexually assaulted and stabbed to death. A bloody knife and biological evidence were recovered from the scene. George Allen Jr. was later identified by police and he was interrogated. Ultimately, he provided a confession that included details of the crime known only to the murderer, or so they thought. Forensic analysis of blood type couldn't exclude Allen, and ultimately a jury convicted him of 99 years. Now, what both of these individuals have in common is that the interrogation led ultimately to a confession that was pretty unique because it included details that would seem to be known only by the perpetrator. But we're going to take a look at those cases in a little bit more depth. But before I do that, how do we know about customary practices? Well, there's no shortage of volumes that have been written. And for those of you that have been trained as interviewers or interrogators, you may be familiar with some of these books. What they all have in common is that they're predominantly based upon an investigator's prior experience in the interview room. And it's that experience that's been codified and led to techniques that are believed to be effective at eliciting confessions and believed to be effective at eliciting diagnostic confessions. Here's what those techniques look like. They often involve a confirmatory mindset in which investigators believe that they have the suspect and that the suspect is the perpetrator. They involve elicitation strategies that are focused, closed-ended questions, and may even include some suggestive or leading questions. They involve an attempt to gain compliance by the subject with the request to provide a confession. And techniques such as minimizing, using theme development or minimizing the perceived consequences associated with confession, and the use of false evidence ploys to kind of overwhelm and maximize the subject's perception of their guilt are used in this context. Evidence presentation tends to be focused on overwhelming the subject's perception in that context. And finally, it's informed by a model of credibility assessment or deception that focuses on anxiety and nonverbal cues to deception. Now, some of you may have seen interrogations over the years. For those of you that haven't, I thought it might be useful. This is a brief clip. It's just a couple of minutes. I apologize, it does involve some language, but not too much. And it's a good example, I think, of the techniques. I want you to be listening for the kind of presentation of evidence, the overwhelming belief that the suspect is guilty, shutting down denials, and then offering themes and face-saving excuses, attempting to minimize the perception of the consequences associated with the action.
So it's one of the
Thank you.
easiest investigations I've had. It's fucking there. And you can't lie about that, bro. I'm giving you an opportunity.
I'm not lying.
Listen to me. I'm giving you
I
an
didn't
opportunity.
hold that gun.
Listen
I
to
didn't
me.
shoot
Listen.
that gun.
Listen to. But when you're telling me that you didn't have that firearm in your hand, we can prove otherwise. We can prove otherwise. I can prove it. I can go in front of the judge and say, hey, look, bro, you want us to play this video? You want us to show you the fingerprint results? You want us to show you the GRE test on this gentleman?
I did not have that firearm in my hand.
Huh?
Is there any reason why your fingerprints are going to be on there?
They're not going to be on there.
Any reason why we got an eyewitness to you shooting that gun? Can you explain to my partner and I why that you were positively identified as the person who shot that gun?
And based on our investigation and the trajectory and stuff like that, we sort of believe that it probably
I did not have that firearm in my hand at all.
It could have been a fucking accident. It could have been an accidental discharge. Okay, but when you're completely denying that, then I gotta think another way, bro. Because
Dude, it's the truth.
you fired the fourth shot. Now we need to know if you tried to kill that deputy or did you just discharge a firearm, and that's the misdemeanor. We need to find out. We have a good idea, but we want to hear it from you. We have a good idea what your intention was, based on the trajectory of the round.
But I'm going to tell you something. You sit here and you hold on to this story. I'm just telling you, it's not a threat. When we put all of the evidence together in a court of law, it's not going to look good, my friend. It's not going to look good. We know you did it. You know you did it.
And everyone in the house says that too?
What do you think? Do I really have to answer that question?
So I'll stop it there. I think you get a good sense of the challenge there, of these techniques. Confrontational, accusatorial, seeking to minimize, overwhelming with evidence, shutting down denials, offering face-saving excuses. One of the challenges with these techniques, of course, is that they can lead to false confessions. We know from the Innocence Project database and other databases that false confessions do occur. In the first 325 exonerations, they represented about 25% of wrongful convictions. There's no shortage of research. In fact, the first half of my career was really spent focusing on trying to understand when false confessions happen, how they occur, and conducting studies in the laboratory to test out those ideas. Let's return to the examples I provided you. So Bruce Gottschalk was interrogated for 3 hours. Detectives lied to him about forensic evidence, refused his request to leave, yelled at him and threatened him, promised to release him if he admitted guilt, and asked numerous leading and forced choice questions. And this is really where the details of his ultimate confession came from. It came from not his knowledge of the crime. He was innocent of it. DNA excluded him subsequently. And he had a number of other pieces of evidence that pointed to his innocence. But that knowledge came from investigators, not from Bruce's own knowledge of the crime. How about George Allen Jr.? He spent 30 years in prison. DNA tests confirmed that Allen wasn't the contributor and pointed to somebody else. Exonerating evidence was actually available at the time, fingerprints that excluded Allen, but they were ignored at the time, and forensic science was shown to be flawed. His confession was elicited by using leading coercive questions, themes that minimize the consequences of confessing, presentation of false evidence, and it also turns out that Allen was diagnosed schizophrenic and intoxicated at the time of interrogation. All of these factors led to these false confessions. So there's lots of research now on consensus factors that lead to false confession. I'm going to summarize these briefly. First, it's a confirmatory process that is initiated by this belief in guilt, that we have the right person. It's the use of accusatorial tactics, which I gave you some examples of, that increase the suspect's perception of the strength of evidence and decrease their perceived consequences associated with confession. And it's the notion that certain individuals are more vulnerable, more susceptible to false confession, including juveniles, those with diminished mental capacity, or other psychiatric symptomologies. The challenge with these techniques is, again, they're based on customary knowledge. They're based on experience. They're shared through peers, through training, through observing others, and they're codified in law. In fact, one of the things that we'll often hear from proponents of the accusatorial practices is that the Supreme Court has ruled that you can do this. The challenge is that law doesn't necessarily mean it's diagnostic, right? Just because it's legal, it may not be scientifically validated. In fact, what we're trying to move to here is a use of theory, the systematic study, and the replication of these studies in different contexts. In fact, over the past 60 years, lots of research has been done and a growing number of studies focused on investigative interviewing, interrogation, credibility assessment, and interviewing generally speaking. And in fact, in the past 10 years, we've seen a real surge in research. And part of that's a product of the interagency group that I mentioned that's led by FBI called the High Value Detainee Interrogation Group. It was started in 2010. It funds research every year. It has a mission of not only an operational mission, but it has a training and a research mission. And those missions are integrated. We've written a number of papers about the HIG. I've been part of the HIG and funded by the HIG since its inception. One of the things I like to highlight about the HIG research is that it's not just experimental research done in a laboratory. It's research that's done in the field, and it moves in a translational manner from the lab through the training academy, evaluating training, all the way out to field observation and starting the cycle over again. So the techniques that I'll talk about today with you have gone through this process of validation from the lab to the field and back. This is a keyword map, if you will, of the research literature that we published a couple of years ago. I just want to point out that there's kind of three clusters of the literature. Well, a cluster on cooperative interviews, and I'll talk about some of the research on cognitive interview and good questions, productive question types. A robust literature on suspect interrogations, and today, of course, I'll talk about rapport and trust, but there's also a nice literature on effective use of evidence and effective presentation of evidence. And then finally, quite a literature on detecting deception. And in fact, that literature is moving towards looking at cognitive cues and taking a cognitive approach to assessing credibility. And what this has resulted in is really a model of science-based interviewing that is, I often argue, the antithesis of the accusatorial approach. It points to a mindset that's exploratory and debiased. We don't know what we don't know, and we have to be open to the possibilities that we might be wrong about what we know. It's an elicitation strategy that uses open-ended and memory-based. I'll talk about productive and mnemonic approaches to questioning. It seeks to facilitate cooperation rather than compliance by fostering trust and rapport. It takes a strategic and truthful approach to presenting evidence. No lying about evidence. Lying about evidence isn't necessary. If you have the evidence, presenting it strategically and truthful is a very effective approach. And then finally, the approach to assessing credibility is focused on cognitive cues, story-based cues. It turns out that distinguishing liars and truth tellers has to do with focusing on the story that they tell you and questioning that story in strategic ways. So I think I saw Mary Catlin on this and Dave Wilson. I want to highlight Mary's terrific meta-analysis of this literature, updating a meta-analysis that we conducted about 10 years ago. This paper is under review. It's part of that HIG-funded, FBI-funded series of meta-analyses where we really assessed across the literature, what are the differences between accusatorial and science-based approaches? And of course, what we know is that accusatorial approaches are significantly more likely to produce false confessions. And in fact, an odds ratio of about 4 times, a little more than 4 times as likely to produce a false confession compared to science-based approaches. And it's really those false evidence ploys and minimization themes that drive this effect. These are the most pernicious in producing false confessions. But what about the other side of the ledger, the true confessions? Well, it turns out that science-based approaches are about 80% more likely to elicit a true confession compared to accusatorial approaches. So they're more productive in generating true confessions, but they guard against the risks of false confessions by dramatically reducing that likelihood. In other words, science-based approaches are more diagnostic. So today I want to talk with you about these first 3, the mindset, the elicitation, and cooperation. I'm going to move kind of fast just to kind of give you an overview of these, focusing in on trust and rapport. But one of the things I want to focus you on is that the goal of a science-based interview is not to elicit a confession, but rather to elicit investigative information that can be subsequently verified. right? The goal has to be the focus on information rather than a confession. And that really speaks to the mindset challenges that investigators have. So let me talk about these three challenges now: mindset, facilitating recollection, and understanding resistance. First of all, when we talk about mindset, what we're really talking about is Gary Klein's notion of sense making, developing a mental map and understanding the world around you through a hypothesis testing manner. There's really three steps to sense making when you break it down. First, it's creating a plausible understanding, a cognitive map, if you will, of a shifting world. We're constantly being inundated with new information, and at times we need to update that mental map. We're going to test that map by collecting information. You can think about this in the investigative context, right? I've presented with some case evidence. I go and talk to some other individuals. It's starting to help me form a mental map, if you will, a cognitive map of this crime or this incident. I'm going to be taking in information as it comes. I'm going to be taking action and exploring some theories or hypotheses that I have about that. But I'm also, over time in that context, going to be refining and hopefully abandoning a cognitive map, a mental map that maybe isn't quite correct. And this, I think, is where the challenge is for investigators. Are they willing to adapt and refine and at times abandon a mental map that may have it wrong? Are they going to be open to new evidence? Sense making in many ways is often described as connecting the dots, right? But it's actually more than just connecting the dots. Sense making helps us determine what counts as a dot and how we might connect them. And the challenge, of course, in this context is that investigators have historically been shown to see deception and infer guilt when they view a suspect's statements. And these are in a number of studies that compare investigators to naive or lay individuals. It's this proneness, this response bias, if you will, to perceive deception and infer guilt that actually leads to a more pressure-filled interrogation. Investigators who have a strong belief in guilt ask more closed-ended and presumptive questions, elicit more known information because they're focusing only to confirm what they know. They force responses when information is not remembered or known. They use more accusatorial tactics, minimization and false evidence ploys. They conduct longer interrogations, and ultimately they elicit more false confessions from the innocent. And in fact, studies show that these longer interrogations are actually applied disproportionately to the innocent versus the guilty. So the challenge here is, how do we counter these cognitive biases of confirmation bias, tunnel vision, anchoring, mirror image effects? How do we engage in effective debiasing strategies? For example, considering the opposite, playing devil's advocate, being open and curious to new information. And finally, how do we structure our analysis in ways that makes explicit our assumptions and allows us to question those assumptions? I think in general, we often coach investigators to distinguish what they know. What is vetted information? What is truly known from unvetted information? How reliable is that information or evidence? Really being able to scale the validity of that information can help an investigator distinguish truly what they know. And then really taking stock and making explicit the inferences that they're drawing about the suspect. There are some inferences that are based on good, vetted information or evidence that are considered strong inferences. But can we recognize when we've made weak inferences? Can we consider the opposite, draw alternative inferences in this context, be challenged by our colleagues? And then we develop key questions from these that allow us to separate what we know from what we're not sure of, and ultimately develop an elicitation strategy. It's really this planning and preparation process and being open throughout the interview that's incredibly important. Let's turn to the second challenge, which is memory. Investigators, probably the biggest challenge is that subjects will often fail to remember key information of investigative importance. And this can be quite frustrating, right? It's memory is a fickle thing. I don't have time to go into all the details on that, but investigators are often faced with the I don't know or I don't remember prompt. Unfortunately, this often leads investigators to ask questions that confirm what they believe to be true, failing to invite open-ended responses or allow the subject some autonomy when responding. What the research is showing, though, is that the use of and the consistent use of productive and mnemonic questioning approaches really do facilitate the collection of relevant investigative information. And let me share a little bit of what I'm talking about here. So productive questions have to do with open-ended questions, that what are often called the TEDs, tell me, explain, describe, show me. The probes, the who, what, where, when, why, how. And of course, appropriate closed-ended questions. What we mean by appropriate closed-ended is that they're not exclusively relied on, they're not repeated, they're relevant to the questioning context when they're used. On the other hand, unproductive questions have to do with closed-ended, suggestive or leading questions, or two alternative, forced choice type questions. My colleague, Laura Brimball, worked with us on a meta-analysis of this literature, identifying 20 studies with over 1,200 subjects, both in the field and in the laboratory, finding very consistently large effects that open-ended questions and productive questions significantly increase the amount of information provided by subjects, and in particular, investigatively relevant information. The challenge when I train investigators is to get them to break some bad habits of moving towards those unproductive, closed-ended questions, investigatively focused questions, and broadening the lens, so to speak, and being patient in how they ask questions and seek to gather information, offering the subject some autonomy. There's been 30 years of research on mnemonic questioning, and in particular, the cognitive interview. I don't have time to go through the cognitive interview, but it, in general, uses a protocol that shifts control over to the subject, that encourages them not to guess, and that uses open-ended, uninterrupted recall. It'll use things like eye closure and context reinstatement, getting people to think back to the experience and asking them to recall again. And then using a series of mnemonic prompts that could have to do with, if you're dealing with a timeline, asking them to recall the events in reverse order, reverse chronological order, asking them to draw a sketch and describe what they're sketching and the event that they experienced, or using a model statement to convey a statement that conveys the kinds of details you're looking for. Sometimes subjects just don't provide those details because they don't quite understand the level of detail that you're asking for. Ed Geiselman and Ron Fisher developed this back in the late 80s, early 90s. There's been decades of research and multiple meta-analyses. My colleague, Melissa Rosano, worked with us to update the meta-analysis literature, the literature in terms of a meta-analytic model. Now, more than 80 studies that have studied this, nearly 5,000 subjects, by the way, studied in other countries, studied with other cultures and other languages, including with individuals with certain developmental disabilities, for example, and with children and with the elderly. Very robustly studied and shown to be hugely effective in eliciting more details than even the very best structured interview approaches that might be out there. Ron Fisher did a great study with FLETC, where he compared the cognitive interview approaches to the FLETC 5-step structured interview protocol, which is a very good interview protocol. We also know that the cognitive interview doesn't sacrifice accuracy. That is, if anything, it's as or more accurate in terms of the quality of the information that's elicited. So one of the challenges, of course, is that you'll often get a subject who says, I don't know, or I can't recall. And the challenge here, of course, is do they not recall that because their memory is poor, in which case I can maybe try to improve that memory, or is it that they're refusing in this context to cooperate with me? And this is Eric Shepard's model of the two dimensions of cooperation and memory. And I think fundamentally, this is one of the challenges for investigators. When you get a subject who says, I don't recall, is it because they don't want to cooperate with you? Or is it because they don't quite recollect the information? Of course, the first step is to use those good interview productive and mnemonic questions. But it's also important to consider that resistance may be the problem, may be the issue here. A lot of the research on resistance in the investigative interviewing domain has looked at resistance behaviors. And studies, and we've done this too, have coded a variety of of behaviors, verbal and nonverbal behaviors that represent resistance or counterinterrogation strategies. And studies have shown that certain interviewing tactics, I'll talk about rapport-based tactics and trust-based tactics, can mitigate the presence or the observation of these resistance behaviors. However, what we were interested in this particular project was delving a little bit deeper and trying to understand what motivations drive resistance. Can we better understand the motivations that drive resistance in a way that we could more target the mitigation strategy? Ultimately, we identified from a systematic review of the literature 3 clusters of motivations that can drive resistance, having to do with identity, relational, and instrumental motivations. Let me just talk briefly about each. Identity-based has to do with how subjects see themselves. So this could have to do with the self-concept taking a hit. If I think about myself as a child molester or as a murderer, a drug pusher, for example. It also could have to do with how I see myself in terms of my autonomy, my ability to act in this situation, or my competence, my ability to understand what's happening in this context. Relational motivations have to do with relationships both inside and outside the room. So the most obvious, of course, is to focus on the investigator and their relationship with the subject. But there are also constituencies that are outside the room that may have to do with family, co-conspirators, or other loyalties that lie outside the room that could cause some reluctance or resistance in providing information. And then finally, there are, of course, instrumental concerns. And these could have to do with evaluations of gains and losses, consequences associated with the behavior, or perceptions of evidence and how they manage their information strategy in that moment. One thing I want to say before I forget is that when we study resistance in this context, we're not just talking about resistance that involves suspects, criminal suspects, but this model is also applicable to witnesses, to victims, to sources of intelligence information. These same motivations can be found in those contexts as well. We've done a number of studies looking at this, from semi-structured interviews with investigators to coding actual interrogations and then conducting interviews with the investigator and the subject of that interview, and doing experiments, of course, in which we can control what subjects experience and then asking them about their motivations. I'll just give you an example of one of the experimental studies here and some data from that, just showing that we can account for about 30% of the variance in resistance behaviors from these motivations. And it does seem pretty consistently that instrumental concerns are likely dominating these concerns, but that relational and identity concerns are certainly contributing. And I think different crimes and different contexts can drive the ratio at which they contribute. I'll also note that they're correlated with one another. So there are some overlaps in these resistance motivations. It's not likely that somebody would have just one, for example. So how can practitioners effectively mitigate resistance? In this context, I work with my colleague and close collaborator friend, Steve Kleinman, former Air Force interrogator and intelligence officer, who I've worked with for now more than a decade. And we did a lot of research with Laura Bremball, identifying the processes that lead to mitigating and understanding resistance. Of course, the first step is recognizing that resistance is happening, looking for those behaviors that I mentioned to you. And next, it has to do with drawing out the motivation. I think too often we teach interrogators to be mind readers. We don't encourage them to ask the why question, to dig deeper. And evocation prompts are all about, tell me what's going on. Tell me why I see this pattern of behavior. Tell me what you're thinking right now. What do you think is causing your reluctance to want to talk to me in this moment? It turns out evocation is a great way to draw out those motivations. And we can show that when people are asked those evocation prompts, they respond in ways that allow us to identify the motivation and to then target our mitigation strategy to that. And then let me just quickly, I don't have a lot of time to go into this, but I'm happy to in the Q&A. There are a number of targeted mitigation strategies that one can engage in. For identity, it has to do with affirming the self-concept, supporting competence, or allowing autonomy in that context to mitigate. Relational, we're going to talk more about developing rapport and trust, but of course, empathic approaches are really important. And then in the instrumental context, it's about asking strategic questions, concealing some information objectives that you might have, help to manage their information management strategies, and of course, strategically presenting your evidence in ways that elicit corrections or resolving contradictions or admissions in that context. So I want to close out today talking about how to develop rapport and trust. And I imagine that most of you have some sense of what rapport is and what trust is. From a scientific perspective, I really like Fiona Gabbard and her colleagues' systematic review on developing rapport. They do a really nice job of covering this literature, and I really like the taxonomy that they offer for the different approaches. And that's what I'm going to present to you today. There's relational approaches to developing rapport, demonstrating an approachable demeanor, and demonstrating that you're paying attention. So in terms of relational approaches, this is all about developing a relationship and closeness with the subject. It's showing interest in them. It's identifying common ground, similarities between you and the subject. It's strategically using self-disclosure, sharing a little bit about yourself in ways that facilitate common ground and bring you away from being seen as an investigator to being seen as an individual. And it's boosting the self-concept by offering affirmations and identifying what's good in the person. Offering an approachable demeanor is pretty straightforward. We're talking about offering positive, open nonverbals and using a conversational tone, engaging the subject in conversation. And then finally, and quite importantly, it's paying attention. Active listening skills, I know, are taught to all investigators at some point, but they're so important. And I think when an investigator is under cognitive load, they're often neglected. Offering empathy and understanding in that context are really important as well. From the meta-analytic literature that I'm going to show you right now, it's the relational and the paying attention that are most important in facilitating positive outcomes that you're looking for. So what's interesting about this literature, and I'm just highlighting a couple of studies that we've done, is that much of the literature focuses on this direct effect of rapport tactics on information disclosure. Unfortunately, studies are inconsistent in their findings of whether rapport tactics directly produce an increase in information disclosure. Rather, what we tend to see in the literature is that rapport tactics do their job by increasing perceptions of rapport, closeness, warmth, familiarity, comfort with the individual. And it's that perceived rapport that facilitates a decision to cooperate by the subject. And it's that decision to cooperate, that voluntary decision, that leads to information disclosure. So rather than it being a direct effect of rapport tactics on information disclosure, what we see is an indirect effect. Again, these tactics like common ground, self-disclosure, affirmations, active listening, or as an MI, motivational interviewing approach to asking open-ended questions, offering affirmations, using reflective statements, and offering summaries. All of these techniques we've shown and others to produce this indirect effect of rapport tactics on information disclosure. So let's look at the meta-analytic literature. This was done by my current postdoc, Amelia Menthoff, and a team that we pulled together. We identified nearly 80 studies in the rapport literature that include field studies, lab studies, children and adults. And again, you can see that most of the studies have been done in the last decade. So what did we find in terms of these effects? Well, it turns out that indirect effect, we can use structural equation meta-analytic modeling to generate that indirect effect. And that indirect pathway across these studies very consistently shown. But the direct effects are either non-significant or small. So again, I just want to emphasize here that rapport tactics operate by promoting a voluntary decision to cooperate with the interviewer. I'll give you one last example here. I'm kind of running low on time, so I'll go quickly here. This is an interviewing study where we manipulated interview conditions by exposing some people to a rapport-based interview, others to accusatorial interview, and others to a direct interview context. And then we measured their resistance motivations at the end of the study. And what we found was, again, replicating this indirect effect of rapport tactics on information disclosure through this voluntary decision to cooperate. But I also wanted to show you that we replicated again that these motivations of identity, relational, and instrumental are predicting resistance behaviors in this context. And this was the opportunity that we had to connect these two models, if you will. And it turns out that this decision to cooperate is what signals, or resist, is what signals those resistance behaviors. And importantly, rapport-based tactics help to mitigate the presence or the observation of resistance behaviors. When rapport-based tactics are used, we see greater perceived rapport, greater cooperation, a reduction in resistance behaviors, and more information disclosure as a product of it. So rapport-based tactics are doing their job in facilitating that voluntary decision to cooperate. Now, in the literature, I'll close here, the literature often, I think, conflates rapport and trust. And I want you to think for a moment, there are probably people that you feel very close to, that you might have a strong rapport with them, but you wouldn't necessarily trust them in a given situation. There's also probably individuals that you would trust in a given situation, but you don't feel very warm or close to them. The point here is that these constructs are distinct in a number of ways, and I just want to highlight that and then talk to you about some trust tactics that we've been exploring. So rapport is a relationship. It's dependent on both parties' involvement, their mutual interests, and it's useful to match that similarity, common ground, self-disclosure, really important. The function here is to facilitate liking and the perceived closeness with someone, warmth, we often talk about. Trust, on the other hand, is a state of mind. And it's important to note here that individuals can be more or less prone to trust. You probably know individuals who are not very trusting in general. I'm going to talk about the cognitive and affective processes that inform trust, but really trust is all about being able to predict the future. In my time of need, when I need assistance or support, can I trust that individual to be there for me, to support me, to come through with me, to maintain my confidence, right? To be there to support me. The goal here is to reduce uncertainty about how events unfold. So trust can be informed by both cognitive and affective processes. The cognitive processes have to do with the perceptions of ability, can you do something, and integrity, will you do something? And in fact, I'll just say here, another component of trust is what's called moral character, people's perceptions of your moral behavior and your moral character. Really kind of in some ways speaks to integrity in that context. And we're actually looking in some of our latest research on that aspect of moral character. The affective component of this is really benevolence. Do you want to help me in that context? Now, in the investigative context, I'll tell you that we've identified that it's cognitive trust that is most important here. And I like to frame it in the context of competence and professionalism, right? There's also the integrity part of it has to do with fairness of process, right? Fairness and justice in that process. Think of procedural justice. So we've looked at a number of trust building strategies, and I like to describe this as kind of two sides of the coin. How can you develop trust with someone? Well, you could demonstrate your trustworthiness, that you can and will do something for someone in a time of need, or you could demonstrate your willingness to trust someone, that you might risk trusting them to do this job or to perform this task or to be there when you need them to be there. Now, importantly, we've identified, and the literature is very consistent on this, we've just validated it in the investigative interview context, that really reciprocity is at the heart of trust building. We need to see that others will do for us as we would do for them, right? And they need to see the same thing. So acts of reciprocity are really important. Well, what's reciprocity? It's being willing to do something for someone without any instrumental gain from it, right? There's no ask on the other side of the act that's offered. I might say to someone who's going out of town, I'd be willing to go over and look after your cat or take care of your dog. Don't mention it. Money? Don't worry about that. I don't need that. So we've looked at both of these strategies, and I want to give you some examples. This is Bob McFadden, friend of ours. He's a special agent with NCIS, and he was responsible for the USS Cole bombing investigation. And Bob had the opportunity to interview Abdul Aziz bin Attash, who was one of the lead actors in this bombing. And bin Attash had been a very difficult interviewee for the country that was holding him. And Bob had to work very hard to engage with him, develop some measure of rapport, and learn what was important to bin Attash. And it turns out that bin Attash had been asking to make a phone call to his wife. And previous investigators had, oh yeah, no problem, we'll get that going. You know, let's just put that to the side. I need to talk to you about this in the meantime. And they had never come through with that promise. Bob elicited that, made a promise to Abdul, put his agenda to the side, and through a lot of orchestration, allowed that phone call to happen. Bin Attash got the opportunity to speak with his wife, who was very concerned about him. Of course, everything was monitored, but there was significant risk in doing this. But what did he do? He demonstrated his trustworthiness, right? That provided affirming evidence that you can trust me in this moment. And Aziz bin Attash said after that, I really appreciate what you've done for me. I'm willing to answer any questions that you might have. And they went on to have a very lengthy interview with lots of investigatively rich information that helped close this case. Wonderful example of demonstrating your trustworthiness through an act of reciprocity. Bob didn't call the quid pro quo. He didn't ask for anything in return. He just showed that he was trustworthy and he would come through. Hans Scharf is a legendary German Luftwaffe interrogator who interrogated many of our American and British fighter pilots that were downed in the war. He had wonderful variety of questioning strategies and rapport-based strategies to engage with those officers, those airmen. And I have a little video I just thought I'd share. You can hear Scharf talk a little bit about those tactics.
These young men, they were usually between 20 and 25, shot down, had a bad time, because first of all, they were lectured by their intelligence officers in England that they were going to have a rough time with those brutal German tin gods of the Third Reich. Well, they were very surprised when I invited them to sit down to have a West Point cigarette. We had special cigarettes made by the Kentucky Tobacco Company called West Point. And every prisoner was very surprised. That's the way it started when I said, have a West Point cigarette. A West Point cigarette? You've got West Point cigarette? Already, rank, name, and number was forgotten. And these young men were treated like a gentleman. I was brought up in a well-to-do German family where I learned in my youth how to guide a blind man across the street. The principle of my family was that the stronger man should help the weaker one, not vice versa, as it often is in this world. And I figured that the prisoner was the weaker one and I was the stronger one. I had everything at my command. I could make his life miserable, I could make his life more pleasant. And I knew very well that an American officer didn't sell out his country for an extra slice of bread or an extra blanket for his cot if it was a cold night. I knew that very well, and I gave it freely to them, which they appreciated. I took them for walks in the beautiful German woods, and there...
So you can see a number of strategies. He showed them great respect. He offered them kindnesses. He treated them with care. And he really engaged them in conversation. He had a number of really effective questioning strategies that my colleagues Simon Oleszkiewicz and Par Anders Granhag and my colleague Steve Kleinman have studied over the years. Lots of a rich literature really dissecting Scharf's methods. But here I want to focus on his acts of trust building. Scharf was terrific at demonstrating a willingness to trust those POWs. He conducted his interrogations, as he said, by taking a walk in the woods with his POW, not in a locked room, right? In fact, many of his conversations were in his office, not in a cell or an interrogation room. He would also take his officers to the officer club, introduce them to some of the German officers, and treat them with respect in that context. And in fact, he went so far, and imagine the risk that he took in this. He had engaged with one of the POWs in conversations about the German Messerschmitt plane. And in fact, he arranged for the airman, the POW, to fly a Messerschmitt. And of course, this was a managed risk, right? He had just enough fuel in the plane to be able to take off, to circle around, and to land again. Each of these acts, though, required some risk-taking on his part. He was willing to accept that risk to show them that I trust you in these contexts. And it paid off immensely. So Simon Oleszkiewicz, my former postdoc and colleague and friend, led these series of studies looking at trust building tactics. And I just want to point out that these trust building tactics operate in exactly the same way as the rapport building tactics. In this context, it goes through cognitive trust as opposed to affective trust. But it's that cognitive trust that facilitates a decision to cooperate. And it's that decision to cooperate, that voluntary decision, that creates the information disclosure context. In subsequent studies, we've identified reciprocity as the key that unlocks the effectiveness of these techniques. It's the notion that someone has done something for me, I must now repay that favor, right? It's that psychological burden that we offer to others. So I hope you followed me through this journey. I've talked a little bit about the transition from accusatorial to science-based approaches. I've talked about the 3 challenges that we often see in investigative interviews. And I've talked about how to effectively leverage rapport and trust to elicit voluntary cooperation from the subject. And I just want to end here with this slide with some recommended best practices that come out of this. One, I think it's time to prohibit the use, to cease the use of those accusatorial approaches, particularly minimization themes and false evidence ploys. And what I didn't show you is that there's not only evidence that they produce false confessions, but there's evidence that these techniques can backfire. In fact, in studies that we and others have done, these techniques, when used, are more likely to elicit resistance behaviors. You're more likely to see the engagement of counter-interrogation behaviors when these tactics are used. Science-based techniques, on the other hand, significantly mitigate resistance and facilitate engagement with the subject. We need investigators to use practices that work to counter their cognitive biases. And I don't use the term cognitive bias as a pejorative. We're all subject to these biases in our daily life. As a professor, I am subject to confirmation bias and tunnel vision in the way that I view some things, or as a researcher, as I view some things. And it's important that I work against that by considering the opposite, by being challenged by my colleagues with counter evidence, and being willing to consider and open to considering that counter evidence. We also want to teach investigators to engage and rely primarily on productive and mnemonic questioning. We want to limit contamination in our interviews, and we want to facilitate the best recollection possible while limiting any errors that subjects might provide. We want to teach investigators and encourage investigators to draw out the motivations that underlie resistance. And we want to make them aware of the motivations that can drive resistance, ultimately being able to then target our mitigation strategies. And I've really focused here, because of limited time, on developing rapport and building trust. But we talked about the relational, approachable demeanor and paying attention in terms of rapport, and we talked about demonstrating your trustworthiness or demonstrating a willingness to trust and engaging reciprocity, the reciprocity principle in that context. I hope this was useful, and it again was an honor. Thank you, Brooke. Thank you, Carrie. Thank you, Sarah. I'd be delighted to answer questions or engage with you offline. I'm going to provide my email here just as we close out. Thank you, Brooke.